Last Tuesday, Queensland's assisted suicide bill was introduced to Parliament and looks set to become Australia's most liberal assisted suicide legislation yet. Firstly, the bill allows access to assisted suicide much earlier than any other jurisdiction currently in Australia. It grants people given 12 months or less to live access to a state-facilitated death. This is double the eligibility period in Victoria and Western Australia's recent legislation, as well as Tasmania and South Australia's bills. Secondly, and I would say most disturbingly, this bill makes mental suffering grounds for eligibility. A third point of difference is that this bill allows for terminally ill persons who are mentally ill or disabled to access a state-facilitated suicide if deemed to have decision-making capacity. Lastly, like WA's laws, Queensland's bill allows doctors and nurses to raise the option of suicide with a patient. I know there are very passionate people on both sides of this debate, but you've got to ask yourself, how is suggesting suicide to anyone under any circumstances acceptable, much less something that ought to be lawful? Keep in mind that the Queensland Parliament has no upper house to vet this bill. It will go to a conscience vote, and that will be that. Tragically, suicide is the leading cause of death in Australians aged 15 to 14, and we rightly consider this an unspeakable tragedy. We pour millions of taxpayer dollars every year into suicide prevention, as we should. So how is it that proponents of assisted suicide have managed to create a category of suicide that is supposedly good, even to the extent of enshrining it in law, despite the fact it's composed entirely of a category of people who are, we would say, some of the most vulnerable Australians imaginable? Do we really suddenly have good suicide and bad suicide? These proponents say that this kind of suicide is a private matter of self-determination. But to quote Paul Keating, it is misleading to think that allowing people to terminate their life is without consequence for the whole of society. Make no mistake, our sanctioning this represents a seismic shift in our societal values. What's unconscionable is that each of these state governments is not passing assisted suicide laws in tandem with increased funding to palliative care. They know Australia has an increasingly ageing population. They know they're woefully unprepared for it. Access to palliative care is the real medical aid in dying. It's able to dissuade the fears of many who might otherwise opt for suicide when left with no other option. Yet here we have willfully created, a situation where Aussies have access to assisted suicide, but not palliative care. Justin, what do you make of this? I mean, as I mentioned, we've got this ageing population. First off, we're talking about baby boomers here, basically. This is a generation who, many of which, and I'm sure you know many of them, I know many of them, they would rather, many of them, rather die than feel a burden on society, much less their nearest and dearest loved ones. What do you make of this? This is an option that we're making to the most vulnerable Aussies at one of the most vulnerable moments in their lives.
Look, hi Liz, I'm glad that there is passion on both sides of this debate, because there's got to be good passion. However, your passion and my passion certainly don't link up on this. I completely disagree with you. Well, no, I won't say I completely disagree. And I also don't like the word suicide being used in the way as assisted suicide, because it's not that. And I think that takes away from the real pain that people go through when they do actually take their life through suicide. I think that's something different. This is about, when it's done right, when euthanasia and assisted dying is done right, it is about giving control to people that are in their right mind, who don't want to suffer at the end of their life. And I also think you skimmed over some important stuff there, and I think I don't want to say misled, but I think you got some stuff wrong. When you were talking about people who have psychological state of being is also grounds. That is not the only ground. A person also needs to be dying. They need to have a terminal illness. But part of that terminal illness is the psychological effect that it is having. Also, the people that have a mental illness not being precluded, they still have to have a terminal illness to be eligible for this. They can't be eligible just by having a mental illness. So, look, you and I disagree on this. I might also point out I never thought I'd hear you quote Paul Keating in the positive, but anyway,
he's got some brilliant things to say on this. Absolutely brilliant. It was Paul Keating who said that assisted suicide, and he does call it assisted suicide, and I do too, and I'll tell you why, Justin, because I believe that a lot of social conditioning is precluded by verbal conditioning. And so I'm calling it what it is, and that is what I believe it is. So, Kai, wrapping it up
Look,
there.
as I said, yeah.
What do you make of this? I understand, as I said to Justin, a lot of people feel very passionately on this on both sides of the debate, but I feel like we've singled out the most vulnerable people in Australia at the most vulnerable time of their lives. And here we are, instead of giving them hope and reason to carry on, we're giving them this option of ending their lives instead.
Yeah, well, look, I must agree with you when it comes to the phrase assisted suicide. If this was simply a matter of ending people's suffering, well, that's what pain relief is. That's what modern analgesics allow you to do. And I think that's one of the big drivers behind palliative care reasoning why they need more funding in this area. I think it is, you are ending someone's life earlier than it normally would have. It's natural conclusion. And I understand why, but of course I'm sympathetic to people who can't stand the idea, first of all, of themselves suffering, but also of seeing their relatives suffering. But I do agree. I mean, it is state-sanctioned termination of life. And this isn't even
garbage.
Like
Justin.
And it's not like the abortion debate where I understand there can be philosophical differences, even if I may not agree with some of them, as to when life begins. But this is a case where people are going to be taking their own lives with the assistance of a medical practitioner before they naturally would pass away. And I think that there is an enormous mental pressure that is put on people that are suffering. I've often heard, I mean, even when I've had elderly relatives sometimes joke. I remember when I was young, one elderly relative said, when I get old and I can't get around, just take me out to the paddock and shoot me, right? Now, she was obviously joking, right? Yeah. But look, I think I know a lot of migrants come from a culture where our priority is to care for our elders. I think that the level of dignity that we attribute to our elders is often, not all the time, but is often different to that, to what we see in the West. And I think that you'll see a lot less support for something like euthanasia or assisted suicide or assisted dying or whatever phrase people might feel comfortable with in those kind of communities. But
Caleb.
You don't agree, Justin.
Caleb, your thoughts on this?
Look, I know this is not a program for fence sitting, but I'm going to get a couple of splinters tonight because this is actually an issue on which I struggle deeply, because while I believe in the sanctity of human life, and I don't necessarily agree with the idea of the state basically allowing people to terminate their own lives, to kill themselves with the assistance of a doctor, I also understand the arguments of people who are in a situation where they have a terminal illness and they have a choice basically between ending their life now with some level of dignity as they want to do it, when they want to do it, versus perhaps receiving palliative care that will essentially ease them into vegetation and they can spend the last of their days sitting in a wheelchair like a mendicant, and all their families can come and line up and say how awful it is, and they can sit there and not do much about it. I mean, that would be a pretty awful position to be in. And like Kai said, I mean, my grandfather, roughly a decade ago, was dealing with cancer. Now, it wasn't at that time terminal cancer, but that was reliant on how well surgery went, and he looked into it. And that was a pretty confronting thing to be told and a pretty confronting thing to learn about. But I, as much as I struggle with the idea of state-sanctioned suicide, I also think, what about people who, in their right mind, who are not people who are mentally ill, who are not people who want to take their own lives because they're, desperate or whatever, if they say, well, look, I want to leave at a time when I feel like I have some control of my body, that I'm still reasonably healthy, I can go out while I'm on top, I have some sympathy for that argument. I don't think we always have to be polarised on one side of the issue, and it's ultimately people like me who are in positions of power in Parliament who will sway the votes on these things, who will decide whether this kind of legislation passes. We're talking about it in South Australia at the moment. We have a number of undecided MPs, and I can totally understand why they are undecided, because it is such a difficult issue. And from many standpoints, I struggle to come to a solid point of view on it.
I do take your point there, Caleb, about those who are, reaching the end of their lives and they want to go before they lose, let's say, able-bodiedness. But I think, again, us as a society saying that is grounds for us to sanction the termination of your life, what message does that send to people who aren't able-bodied? We don't... with every other kind of suicide prevention, we say to people who want to go before their natural end, whatever the circumstances, whether it's being able-bodied, whether it's something mental, etc. and so on, whatever the circumstances, we're going to do everything to get you through this so that you will see it out to its natural end.
Well, I don't think we should underestimate the fight in people to actually survive when push comes to shove. And there are a lot of people who talk about, if I ever get to the situation where I end up in a wheelchair or whatever, I've got terminal cancer, I'd like to take my own life. But I suspect a lot of those people, when actually faced with that choice, would not take it, because it is almost an instinct to hold on for life, and whether that be for your family, it be for personal reasons or whatever. I think a lot of people in that circumstance, when given that option, wouldn't want to do it. As much as they might have thought about it, they wouldn't want to do it, because that instinct to maintain and continue their lives would override any logical thoughts they might have about leaving now while they're on top.
Look, I've got to say, I mean, I respect the three of you a great deal, but I honestly can't believe some of the stuff that I'm hearing. We're talking about completely different things here. When you're talking about assisted dying, it is not suicide. It is not state-sanctioned suicide. And we were talking about dignity and people, maybe wanting to go out on top. That is not the way it works. The real dignity is in somebody having control. When someone believes that their life is going to end in excruciating pain, not just that they're going to be unwell. And I know that we want the thought of people sitting in palliative care, surrounded by people that they love, and having the opportunity to tell each one of those person what they meant to them, and that the person slips away gently, and that can be in many ways, can be a very beautiful occasion. That is not the end of a lot of people. They end in grotesque agony, and for them to know that they have this control before that agony comes makes a great deal of difference. Many of them like to know that they have that control, but they will never actually use it. But that control makes a great deal of difference at the end of their life. I really think that the three of you and me are talking about completely different things.